Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now today we're going to talk about something which a lot of knife and sword makers get wrong. Or do they? Well, it's a slightly complicated topic, but let's try and deal with it as concisely, unusual for me I know, but as concisely as possible. So it is the subject of distal taper. Well, we normally talk about distal taper in blades, but distal taper in tangs. Now, this is only really noticeable, although it is obviously present, on all tangs. And this is, for those who don't know, distal taper is when something gets thinner and thinner and thinner down towards one end of itself. Now, distal taper isn't always linear. It doesn't always happen at the same rate. And there isn't always distal taper present. So some objects don't have distal taper in the blade, and some objects don't have distal taper in the tang. So what I'm not saying here, just to make clear, is that not necessarily all knives or swords have to have distal taper in either the blade or the tang, but we're looking at tangs specifically here. They don't necessarily have to have it. They don't have to have it for mechanical or strength reasons or any other, balance or any other reasons. But it is extremely common in historical artifacts to find distal taper in the tang. That means that the tang is thicker here and gets thinner and thinner and thinner until it's much thinner or flatter up here at the butt end. And where I only take real issue with this not being present in modern made objects is when it should be present in the type of object if it's a replica. So let's be clear here, a replica is a replication of a historical artifact. So if someone's making a replica of a 19th century machete or a replica of a 14th century basilard or anything else really, a 18th, 19th century knife or Bowie knife, something like this, or a bayonet, or a sword, it could be anything, it could be an 1853 pattern full width tang British cavalry sword. If that thing is supposed to have distal taper in the tang, then the replica of it should also have distal taper in the tang. Now let's just briefly consider why to have distal taper in the tang and why it isn't found in some modern objects. Well, quite simply, the reason why it's often not found in a modern replica when it should be found in a replica because it's found in the original object is because traditionally, these blades were forged with a hammer out of a lump of steel, whereas in modern times they are usually cut out of a plate of steel and then ground. Now that's obviously not always true, and some people are forging blades and still not putting any distal taper in the tang when there should be some in the historic original. And equally, sometimes these were forged out of a lump of steel, and for whatever reason they decided to have a full width tang. I'm going to show you some examples in a moment. Now this is a 19th century, possibly early 20th century, but I believe it to be 19th century, unidentified yataghan knife. It actually has Indian script on it, so I believe it to be from northern India, from late British Raj period, and we don't really know the history of it. But anyway, more about that perhaps in a future video. But as you will see, hopefully, it has a full width tang which is visible front and rear, and it very clearly goes from being thick at the base to thin up here. Now why? What does that achieve? Well, a lot of people like the explanation of, well, it saves material, and that's true. However, steel wasn't hugely expensive or valuable or hard to come by, certainly in the late 19th century within the British Empire. Quite a lot of steel around. They made bridges of it, they made railways and locomotives and all sorts of other things out of steel. Even tracks in mine shafts and picks and everything you can think of. So enormous great steamships. So they had plenty of iron and steel around. The main reason for doing this is really, in my view, to do with weight saving. It makes the overall object lighter. Potentially it can also increase or rather improve the balance of the object and the feeling of it, because it means that you're lessening the mass up at the butt and you're centering the mass here. Also, in terms of strength, of course, that is where you want the greatest amount of width in the blade material and tang material, because that is the greatest, the junction between the blade and the tang, or hilt, is the greatest stress point, basically. And also you'll notice in terms of width, you go from a wide blade here to a thinner grip here, so obviously you want the tang to be thicker there. But you don't need the tang to be thicker at the butt, and in fact, if you have the tang thick at the butt, which it must be admitted some artifacts do, but if you have the tang still thick at the butt, it means that the overall weight of the object is more, and you change the balance of the thing and things like this. Okay, so as an example, I'm going to pull out this relatively modern made Sheffield little hunting knife, Bowie knife, and you will see that the tang, I'll just bring that close here, the tang is the same width. It's clearly a slab all the way along here, and in fact if we look at the back of the blade, you can see it's flat all the way along, and essentially there's no distal taper in this. Now this is made by A. Wright and Son of Sheffield, a company that's still around. I don't know how they're forging these, but I suspect that these are cut, these are probably laser cut or something like that, out of a sheet of steel, and then they are probably the edge bevels forged on. If these are forged out of a bar, which is possible, I don't know how they're currently making knives, then it is possible that they have just chosen to have a flat tang. Now what I should say is, if we look at 19th century originals, of which I own probably about 20 19th century original Bowie knives, we see both. You do actually see some tangs like that, which are the same thickness all the way down, and you do see ones that are tapered. Here is a modern, probably 1970s, it's made by Carr and Naylor, I believe a revival of the company, and I don't think the company is still in operation, but I picked this up in auction, so it's modern, but it's made to a 19th century pattern, and this is what I would describe as a much better quality modern replica. And you can see here that the tang goes from thick, very thick here, which is obviously the same thickness as the blade, and it gets thinner and thinner and thinner to the butt up here. So this is actually quite commonly found on 19th century Bowie knives and various other types of historical knife. Actually, we can go all the way back to the medieval period, and very often these full width tangs, and you can even look at Langmesser and types of sword, Dussac and things like this, that do have a tapering tang like this. And as I've said, this can improve balance, also reduce the mass, the total mass of the object. Basically, you don't want a hilt that's overly heavy. Couple of other examples that are contrasting. These are two bayonets, both for the Martini Henry rifle. This is the so-called Yataghan bayonet, which is modelled on the earlier 1856 Enfield, and this is the 1879 Pioneers sawback. As you can see, it's got a saw edge along the back, which is quite sharp, so be quite careful with it. And this was issued to pioneers, could be used as a tool and a sword and a bayonet. Both of these will fit on a Martini Henry. Oh, I must correct myself, this doesn't have the inner ring, so this is actually the earlier Enfield one, but they did have these for the Martini Henry, and I have one of those as well. I got them mixed up. And interestingly, if we look at the tangs on these, I think if we look at the back of the tang, is probably the clearest indicator. You can see on this one, it is actually the same thickness all the way up. Same thickness there, and then it connects to the block which locks onto with the spring that locks onto the rifle, and the muzzle goes through there. So this is a tang that doesn't taper down, but if we look at the earlier Enfield Yataghan bayonet, I think you might be able to see more easily on maybe the front of this one actually. There we go. There we go. We can see that it's slightly thicker there than there. It doesn't taper a lot. Now, there is a possible explanation for why these don't taper very much, and that of course is the fact that they are bayonets, and they must have this unit, this locking stud and slot and slide connecting point at the butt, which means that has to be very, very strong. So you wouldn't necessarily want a very thin tang at the base here. So they've got a reason not to taper down very much. But as we saw on the Bowie knife, when you don't have a reason to have an very strong connecting point at the bottom there, and you really want good balance and lightness, actually having a tapered tang is a very good idea. And Again, this is about replication of originals. It's not necessarily saying that one is always better than the other, or that one is correct and one is wrong. This is about replication. And if you're replicating historical originals, then you need to look at what do the historical originals do. And if you're making a replica of, let's say, like I say, a 19th century machete, or a basilard, for example, from the 14th century, if that original has a tapered tang, then ideally you need to be replicating that and giving it a tapered tang. The final knife example I will give is, this is the just done a review of this on the channel if you haven't seen it actually already. So this is the Mark III Kukri, as issued to the British and Indian armies in World War II from about 1943-44 onwards, and this is made by Windlass Steelcrafts, who started out making these in the Second World War and still make them today, and this is an example. Link below incidentally if you're interested in these. But these replicas of this type of Mark III, so you'll notice the Mark III Kukri has a full width tang, and the replicas of these that I have seen some companies making replicas of these where the tang is the same, let's just get here, where the tang is the same thickness at the base here as it is up at the junction with the blade, or where it becomes blade rather than the hilt. And this is incorrect according to the originals. I have to say, on the blueprints it's not completely clear, but on the original examples, that certainly I own one example and I've seen plenty of others, the originals usually are forged so they actually taper down. So you're thick here, thin here. Windlass are doing this like the originals were made. These are forged, hand forged, and they get thinner and thinner down here. If you have a tang, and look how much width we've got on the tang there. If you have a tang which is very wide at the base, at the butt, and you also make it thick, what you're doing is you're back weighting the weapon and you're making the total weapon heavier. So with this particular weapon, it's really important to taper that tang down in order to give the right amount of total mass, but also the right balance in the hand and the authority in the blade. You don't want to have a butt heavy weapon when you're essentially dealing with a small knife that you want to have a lot of chopping power. Okay, to have that chopping power, you want the mass to be concentrated in the blade and in front of the hand, not behind the hand. Again, some kukri makers really get that wrong and they just have a flat slab tang. Now into, oh, and there's one other thing I want to mention before I go into swords. So I'm going to show two swords as an example. So there is another, let's try and find a good example here. I think, no, that's not going to work with that one. I'm actually going to have to show this with a sword. Okay, so let's go into the swords now. But just to explain what I was going to explain before I couldn't find an example. As well as the tang tapering, so if the blade is up here, as well as it tapering down towards the butt, you've also got cross-sectional taper. And sometimes if you have a wedge section blade, you will actually find that the tang is also tapering from back to front. So very often you will find if the blade is a wedge section all the way down to the hilt, then the tang will continue as a wedge section. So as well as it tapering from blade to butt, it will also taper from back to front as well. So you've got 2 degrees of taper to think about here. And that is all, of course, taking mass away from the tang, putting it up where you want it to be in front of the hand. So here is an example. This is a very unusual sword incidentally, but it's got a fairly typical tang. Charles Reeves's patent tang, where you can see here, hopefully, there we go, that the tang very visibly starts off very thick, about a centimetre or maybe 9mm, and goes down to about 3mm at the butt here. It tapers down all the way down there. Now at the front, and you can't see this very easily unfortunately because of the garden front, at the front, if we just look at the blade for a second, you'll notice that the blade is much thicker at the back than at the front. What this means is that the tang is also thicker at the back than it is at the front. So it has to wedge taper that direction and wedge taper that direction. Okay, so it's tapering in 2 directions. And this tapering found on swords, we can find it in medieval langmesser, we can find it in machete type objects, don't actually have a machete. I suppose the closest I've got is this one, which I've already shown. Okay, so this is very much like a typical machete grip of the 19th century. And we can find it in military swords as well when they utilise full width tangs in the 19th century. Now, famously, the company Wilkinson sword started using the Charles Reeves patent tang. So this is an example which features, there's an article about this sword on Easton Antique Arms. If you look in the if you look on the research section on Easton Antique Arms, then you can find an article about this sword. And this has a full width tang that is not visible at the back because it has a back strap enclosing it. But at the front, you can just about see the tang, hopefully. Now what's interesting, and you might notice, is it is the same thickness all the way down here. But having seen these taken apart, that shouldn't make you think that the tang doesn't taper down, because it does at the back. Because remember what I've just said, the blade is thicker at the back than the front. Okay, so there's the back of the blade, and there's the front of the blade. So what you're seeing here is only the front edge of the full width tang, and the front edge is the same thickness as that all the way down, but the back starts off as thick as that and does taper down to the same thickness as the front. So essentially what we've got is the front of the tang is one thickness all the way down, but the back of the tang goes like this and then becomes at the end, at the butt, at the nut essentially, at the pommel, becomes the same thickness as the front. So somewhat complex. So just to wrap this up, this is a sort of criticism video, but sort of not, in that my only criticism is of people who are replicating a type of sword or knife and don't do a tapered tang where there should be a tapered tang, usually on that type of sword or knife. As I've shown on historical originals, sometimes there are originals that simply don't have that taper. Okay, and that's fine. Having the same thickness all the way down, if you're replicating that particular object or that particular type of object, that's fine. But if it should have tang taper, please put tang taper in it. And I do believe that if you're replicating an object, if it has distal taper in the blade, and it has distal taper in the tang, then it's just as important to replicate the distal taper in the tang as it is to replicate the distal taper in the blade, not only for reasons of the fact that you're staying true to the original and replicating it, but this is also how you will get the actual feel of the original object, the balance of it, the overall mass, and in some cases how the whole hilt construction will work with the tang, because some types of hilt construction only look the same as the original if you have a tapered tang on there. I hope this has been useful and interesting for some of you, and I will see you really soon again on Schola Gladiatoria channel for another video on the subject of knives and swords and history and things like this. Cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.